Banana bread is probably the thing I bake most in our house, and I had a lot of bananas that were very ripe, so I used those up to make the best banana bread. Don't throw your brown bananas away. There's so many ways you can use them, and they're especially good in banana bread, so I started by mashing up 3 to 4 bananas. Depending on the size, you can add some more, cracking in an egg. Instead of sugar, I use some maple syrup, some vanilla extract, melted butter. However much cinnamon your heart desires, give that a really good mix before adding in some baking powder and baking soda. I like this recipe because everything stays in one bowl, so less cleanup. I add some flour to that, give that a really good mix, and then I usually add some chocolate chips or nuts to the mixture and make sure they're incorporated really well before spooning my batter into my loaf pan and popping it in the oven for about an hour. Usually I would let this cool completely in the loaf pan, but we couldn't wait today, so I cut a slice and top it with some butter. My husband's been on a real ice cream kick lately. We ran out of ice cream, so I decided to combine 2 of his favorite things, ice cream and cinnamon rolls, and make a cinnamon roll ice cream. I heated my milk mixture on the stove while I combined all of my egg yolks and gave that a good whisk before pouring in some of that hot milk. Then I transfer all of that back to the stove and let it thicken a little bit before adding it to a bowl with some heavy cream. Make sure to strain it just to get all the bits out. I added some vanilla and some more cinnamon before covering it with cling film and setting it in the fridge for a few hours. In the meantime, I made my cinnamon roll dough with some butter, some sugar. I used some whole wheat flour, a little bit of milk, and obviously some more cinnamon. I let that go until it all came together in a cohesive dough before transferring it over to a bowl. I placed this in the fridge until my mixture was cool, and right before churning my ice cream, I made a quick cinnamon swirl that I would drizzle on top of the ice cream. Once all of my ingredients were prepped, I turned on my ice cream churner and poured in my ice cream mixture. I let that go until it thickened up before adding my cinnamon roll dough and letting that go for another few minutes. Once it looked like soft serve, I transferred it over to my storage container. It needed a little bit more, so I drizzled it with my cinnamon swirl and some more of the dough that was left over, and then it was ready to go in the freezer for a few hours. By this time, both Lucky and I couldn't wait any longer, so we had it, and it was so good that he stole that bowl and I made myself another bowl. The different textures were so perfect. He actually ended up finishing that whole tray of ice cream, so I'm making a new batch. Toddlers requested some yogurt this morning and we were running low, so I just decided to make it myself. They always have to have granola with their yogurt, so I made that first by adding some oats, cinnamon, maple syrup, a smidge of peanut butter, some coconut oil, some coconut flakes. I gave that a really good mix and also decided to add some peanuts in there as well. I transferred that over to my baking sheet, pressed it down, and then popped that in the oven. In the meantime, I poured some milk into my pot and heated that up on the stove. Once that barely reached a simmer, I let that cool off, pulled out my granola, sprinkled it with some cherries, cranberries, and some more coconut flakes. When my milk was lukewarm, I combined some of the leftover yogurt I have with the warm milk before pouring it back into my milk, covering that with a towel and letting it rest in a warm place for a few hours. By this time, my granola had cooled enough for me to break it up and put it away in a glass jar. Depending on the consistency you want your yogurt to be, you can let it sit for about 6 hours or overnight before popping it in the fridge for another few hours. Once I pulled my pot out of the fridge, I gave the yogurt a good mix and it was ready to serve. Put some yogurt in the bowls, topped it with the granola, added some raspberries, and obviously a drizzle of honey. I popped any leftovers in the fridge and they were so excited to have this. I make fresh butter at least once a week, so let's make some roasted garlic and parsley butter today. I start by roasting my bulb of garlic in the oven and then pour some heavy cream into my KitchenAid. I whisk it on a low to medium speed at first while I chop up my parsley. I give it a good chop and make sure that it's small enough to incorporate into the butter. Once my heavy cream reaches this stage, I turn up the speed to a medium-high speed and just let it go until the buttermilk separates. Once that happens, I turn my mixer off and my butter is pretty much done. You can use a strainer or your hands to just get all that buttermilk out. Just make sure you get as much of it out as possible. A lot of the times I ask Lucky to come help me with this since I'm not that strong. Once all the buttermilk is pressed out, I transfer my butter over to a plate, sprinkle it with some parsley, my roasted garlic, some flaky sea salt, and make sure that it's all incorporated before I transfer it over to the fridge and some wax paper to store. Here are the things I prepped to make breakfast a lot easier and quicker in the mornings. I started off by prepping some bagels. I made my dough earlier that morning and let it rise. Once it was done, I punched it to release all the air and then formed them into my little bagels. While I was forming them, I heated up some water and honey on the stove to drop them into and boil them really quickly before pulling them out and adding some toppings. I popped those in the oven and got started on making some applesauce. I've been craving applesauce so much lately and my kids love it. They always have it on top of waffles or pancakes, so I made extra this week. I also had some strawberries that I wanted to use up, so I added those in as well. I boiled my apples on the stove with some water and sweetener until they were soft and added in my strawberries before blending it up. You can get it to whatever consistency you like. At this point, my bagels were done baking, so I let them cool on my wire rack while I got started on making some cassava waffles. These are gluten-free and dairy-free. I started making them when I was struggling with eczema a lot, so they've just become a staple in our house because they're so good and I prefer them over normal waffles. I tend to make a blueberry compote every week, so that's what I did today as well. I let that cool and made some pickled onions and jalapenos. I used my mandolin to slice them, added some smashed garlic, my vinegar mixture, and also some chili flakes. Gave that a good mix and set that aside. We've been loving breakfast potatoes, so I also wanted to add something savory. I fried up some sausage and added broccolini to that, and then fried up my potatoes and onions separately. While that was going, I made a quick pico, which goes really well with the breakfast potatoes and sausage, but also on some breakfast tacos. I put that in little glass containers to cool off and waited until they were cold enough to pop a lid on top, but this is everything I prepped. I love having both sweet and savory options to grab in the morning. Everyone loves French toast in my house, so when my toddlers requested it this morning, I decided to just make it for them. I started off by making my brioche bread by adding some yeast, flour, milk to my bowl and letting that activate. Then I added in all of my eggs, some more flour, and kneaded that dough until it all came together. Once it started coming together and forming a dough, I cut up some butter and slowly dropped that in until it was all incorporated. Then I covered that and let that rise until it was doubled in size before portioning it off in 3 portions. I rolled those out until they were about 9 inches long. I pinched the top together and then braided it up and tucked the bottom under so it would create a seal. I placed my dough into my loaf pan and let that rise until it was about doubled in size. In the meantime, I prepped my mixed berry compote by combining some frozen berries with some maple syrup and lemon juice and letting that reduce on the stove. Once that came together, I transferred it over and let that cool in my bowl. I brushed my brioche with some egg wash and popped that in the oven for about 35 minutes before pulling it out. I let that cool while I made a quick whipped cream, because who doesn't love French toast with whipped cream on top? At this point, my bread was cool enough to slice, so I cut it into slices, making sure that they weren't too thin before I combined my egg with some heavy whipping cream, vanilla, and cinnamon to dip my bread in. I coated both sides and then placed my bread in a buttered up pan. I fried it until it was golden brown, and then it was time to plate. I put my French toast down, topped it with the mixed berry compote, whipped cream, and I also had some passion fruit lying around, and the kids love it, so I put that on top, and they absolutely loved it. Mango sticky rice is all I can think about, and after ordering it and getting the tiniest portion, I just decided to make it myself. We buy a lot of mangoes when they're in season, so I started off by making some mango ice cream. I diced up my mango, added them to a blender with some sweetener and lemon, gave that a good blend, then combined some heavy cream, milk, and some sugar, added my mango puree, and let that chill in the fridge before transferring it over to my ice cream churner. I churned it for about 20 to 30 minutes until it reached a soft serve consistency, and then I popped that in the freezer while I got started on my sticky rice. I had the rice soaking the night before and added it to my steamer. I let that steam while I started on my coconut sauce that was going to go in with the rice, which was coconut milk and some sweetener and a pinch of salt. Once my rice was finished steaming, I added my coconut milk to it, covered it, and just let it sit while I made thicker coconut sauce to go on top of the rice. I let that reduce on the stove while I finished up prepping all of my other things, which was slicing some mango. And by this time my rice had soaked up all of that coconut milk, so it was time to plate. I put down my rice, added my mango, added some of that coconut cream on top with some sesame seeds, and then obviously had to pull out my mango ice cream. The cold ice cream went perfectly with the warm rice, and this was absolutely divine. My toddlers have been asking for marshmallows ever since we ran out, so today I decided to surprise them by making them some salted caramel marshmallows. I started by making the caramel syrup by melting down some sugar with some butter and then slowly adding in some heavy cream. I let it boil for a couple minutes and then add some flaky sea salt in before transferring it over to a glass container so that it can cool. Then I move on to making my marshmallows by combining some water and gelatin and letting that bloom. I wanted to keep these sugar-free, so I used honey instead. Once my honey mixture was hot enough, I poured it in with the gelatin and whipped it until it was light and fluffy. In the meantime, I dusted my baking dish with some arrowroot powder and then spooned the marshmallow fluff into it. This was all very sticky, so I made sure my hands were damp before I went in to smooth it all out. My caramel sauce had cooled enough, so I put dollops on it on top of my marshmallow fluff and then swirled it in. I sprinkled some flaky sea salt on top and also some more arrowroot powder so it wouldn't stick. I let that sit for about 5 hours and then it was ready to get sliced. I went with bigger squares and the caramel on top was so perfect. My husband's been craving barbecue chicken pizza and he wanted to order it for dinner tonight, so I decided to get a head start and just make it myself. I never thought I'd be making barbecue chicken pizza as a European, but here we are. I started by making my dough and letting that rise for about 2 hours. And in the meantime, I made my barbecue sauce by combining some ketchup, red wine vinegar, garlic, some other condiments, and letting that simmer. Once it's thickened, I let it cool and started on making my cheese. I made a simple mozzarella cheese by combining some milk with some rennet and some citric acid, letting that sit, slicing up my curds in a grid pattern and then returning that to the stove. Then I let it drain and stretched it out to form my little cheese balls. Once my dough has doubled in size, I flour down my work surface and make sure to coat it in all that flour because it is really sticky. I divide it into 4 pieces, form those into little balls, and let those rest for another 30 minutes. Cover them with a kitchen towel to prevent them from drying out, and then move on to making my shredded chicken. You can season it however you like. Just make sure your pan is really hot to get a good sear on it. I let that fry and slice up my red onion in the meantime. Once my chicken was done and rested, I shredded it up and set that aside. I like prepping all my ingredients, so I sliced up my mozzarella and also decided to add some banana peppers. At this point, I formed my dough into little circles, spread some of that barbecue sauce on there. Then I went in with some chicken, peppers, some onion, my mozzarella, and slid that onto my pizza stone. Let that bake for about 5 to 6 minutes, topped it with cilantro, some more barbecue sauce, and dinner was done.